All right, so I'm going to talk a little about the work of the World Bank, and then kind of a global development perspective to some of the issues that have been discussed here over the past few days as well, touching on the landscape of data globally. And then giving an example, a couple of examples maybe of World Bank projects or initiatives. One of them is on digital identity, which is something that has been talked about here quite a lot as well. I'm a fairly new phase at the bank. I started working there in March this year, so don't ask me too difficult questions about the organization. I'm still learning them myself. But to begin with, as I mentioned, I work for the Digital Development Department, and our mission is really to accelerate shared digital development globally. This means many things. I think mostly we're focused on the so-called foundations, so still a lot of the work is connected to digital infrastructure and other kinds of layers that we build on top of that infrastructure. So we're dealing a lot with digital platforms these days, ranging from payment systems, for example, to identity as kind of foundational elements of digital development and digital economy. A lot of the projects deal with economic development. We're an economic development institution, but of course the World Bank today, it's not only about economics. I mean, there's a strong social angle to our work as well. We put in 2006, well actually in 2017, we published what was called the World Development Report 2016. They come out, well, late in the year, but this was talked about in 2017 really. That was the kind of first comprehensive look at this phenomena of digital development from the World Bank perspective. It was called digital dividends. And I'm not going to explain that in much detail, but I think a fundamental message there was that this is really not about technology, that if we really want to reap benefits out of digital technology, we have to focus on what were called in that report the analog foundations, and those relate to regulations, skills, and institutions. So those really matter. Without those building blocks, without those in place, it's very difficult for countries to really benefit from technological development. So that was a fundamental message. A landmark report for the bank, really. As I mentioned, a lot of the work deals with infrastructure development. Just to recap what's happening there, I think we have to recognize, if we are going to have a global discussion, I think we have to acknowledge that half of the world's population is not on the internet, they're not online. So this is still the situation today in 2018. There's been tremendous growth, especially due to mobile connectivity, the explosion of mobile connectivity really globally. So whereas here you see the kind of growth in fixed internet, I think around 38-39% of the world's population has access to fixed internet today. But if you look at what's happening in the field of mobile connectivity, that has really exploded. And the growth in mobile internet access is a key factor for the future in developing countries, in continents such as Africa. That's the platform. But regardless of the connectivity, I think there's another kind of divide emerging, and that deals with traffic and deals with data, of course. And just a couple of figures there. For example, if we look at where global IP traffic is emerging from, we see that, for example, even though North America constitutes around 5% of global population, 1/3 of internet traffic emanates from North America, and the same is for Europe as well. So the parts of the world that are most populous are not really represented in terms of the data that we generate and the traffic that we generate. And on the right-hand side, if we look at the the issue of language and linguistic diversity. Over half of the content on the internet websites are in English. So many of the world's languages, which there are thousands of, are extremely poorly represented online. So this is one aspect of the data divide. Another deals with mobile data usage. As I mentioned, mobile internet access is today the kind of primary means of getting online. But if we look at the situation, and especially the projections of where data usage is going to go, this is looking at the situation in 2022. There's a projection of really rapid growth in mobile data usage in North America, Western Europe, OECD countries, also parts of Asia. But if we look at what's really happening in Africa, for example, people are going to be left behind. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is the price. What do you pay for getting online? What do you pay for using the internet? If you look at the absolute prices, it's clear to see that people in high-income countries, OECD countries, pay the most. Data is the most expensive here, but in relative terms, of course, if we look at the continents that are poor and the countries that are poor, people pay much more for internet access than we do. So this situation is not even going to be corrected anytime soon. So it's a key factor, kind of producing an obstacle for people to actually get online and use the internet. A third picture, and this leads us to thinking where the value from all this data, all this traffic, all this use is captured. The concentration of platform businesses globally is becoming a key factor. I think this is something that has been discussed here also. The tech giants, the giant platform companies that kind of dominate our daily lives, they mostly come from North America. Some from Asia, of course, some from Europe. But for example, in Africa and Latin America, you have very few big so-called platform businesses that are able to benefit in economic terms from this digital economy. So that growth in internet use will lead to more and more benefit by Western companies, and of course some of the companies coming from China, for example. And then, how well are you protected? This is a landscape of global data protection legislation, an UNCTAD map that they update every now and then. I think this is from spring this year, portrays the state of data protection worldwide using simply the existence of legislation as a kind of an indicator. Now I know this doesn't necessarily mean much because this doesn't give you a picture of what the quality of that legislation is. It doesn't give you any kind of picture how enforceable that legislation is or what kind of capacity exists in these countries in terms of enforcing it. But anyway, I think around 108 countries have some kind of data protection legislation in place, but we have around, I think, 35 countries that are in the process of developing legislation in this field. But there are huge gaps, especially in Africa, parts of Latin America, Southeast Asia, the Pacific. There are countries that simply have no legislation in place. So it's a kind of a Wild West type of scenario there. You might have other laws, other pieces of legislation in place that are used for protecting data or so on, but you don't have specific legislation there. And this corresponds fairly well with, this is a World Bank Index of Digital Adoption worldwide, looking at how well people, businesses and governments adopt and use technology. And this corresponds pretty well to the picture here. The countries that are experiencing less adoption, that are less enthusiastic from the government side to adopt technology or have less capacity to do so, of course, then see less need for having specific legislation or have less capacity in developing legislation in this place. And in terms of the quality of that legislation, this is a kind of a work in progress type of a diagram that can lead us to thinking about what kind of policy frameworks do we actually need for countries to benefit from the emerging digital economy or the data economy. And there's very few places on earth that really have proper understanding of what the building blocks here are, or have put in place so-called holistic data policies that can take into account both the infrastructure angle, how data is collected, used, shared, protected, can look at the trust building layer, how you create trust in the system in terms of privacy, data protection, providing for basic freedoms such as freedom of information, have legislation in place to enable cross-border data flows, data localization, etc. Or then can look at the wider angle of really benefiting from the data economy in terms of using open data or reusing public data, sharing private sector data within some sort of a legislated framework, developing entrepreneurship, innovation and skills around this. So all these layers, all these building blocks, we see as necessary, but of course it's going to be a gradual process to develop those. At the same time, given this global landscape, at the same time we're experiencing and have experienced in recent years, I'd say in the past 5 years or so, also kind of an explosion in the global development landscape of all these massive institutions like the UN and different UN agencies, as well as the World Bank, my organization, is starting to really explore how we use big data in our operations, how we can really from both public data as well as private sector data and innovate around how we deliver products and services globally. And this is kind of contrasted against the so-called sustainable development goals, which are the globally defined UN goals for 2030, all 17 of those. And you can find very good examples in each one of these areas of really interesting innovations, really interesting pilot projects, or even projects that have scaled up significantly in kind of enhancing, developing efficiency, developing innovation, etc. in our types of organizations. There are a whole host of events globally. There's one example here, the AI for Good, which is something that the ITU organizes every year now. I think this year there's the second one of those. And there's a really vibrant discussion around this topic. We also have done quite a lot. For example, this is just one example. We started just last year kind of an internal lab looking at blockchain and AI and looking at developing internal capacity and know-how processes in terms of how we explore, test and understand technology capability in this space, how we integrate these technologies into our operations. And it's early days, but there seems to be a lot of interest on our side as well as from our partners to collaborate in this space. We've established trust funds. The Digital Development Partnership is one of those where we can bring governments as well as private sector partners in to contribute to this shared agenda, to build joint projects, to share resources and expertise. Just this year, in the spring, in April, we launched a partnership with the GSMA, which is the Global Alliance of Mobile Operators, a global alliance for looking at harnessing big data and Internet of Things in our projects, looking at how we integrate those in the design and implementation of World Bank projects globally. And these can be big projects. They can be in the range of several hundreds of millions of dollars spent in a country to develop, for example, digital infrastructure or agriculture or education or identity systems, etc. But these are just one examples, it's not an exhaustive list. And we're dealing with, in many contexts, this is a case of Somalia, a fragile state or a fragile country. We're dealing with a situation where the government doesn't necessarily have a lot of capability in terms of providing services, providing service infrastructure for its citizens. And we might be dealing with a situation where we have to utilize private infrastructure for that. So Somalia is a good case of this. Somalia's financial infrastructure today is reliant on mobile money. And such is the case for many other African countries. Somalians, many of them might have a bank account, all of them can use cash, but the most popular means of doing financial transactions is mobile money. So people are using this to make payments to schools, receive payments from the government or aid agencies, to trade, to buy, to receive remittances, etc. So it's a staggering piece of statistics that 73% of the population over the age of 16 use mobile money services in Somalia. And another example of how these kinds of partnerships work, or how the World Bank can benefit from private data infrastructure, in this case, a transportation platform. And there was a good critique of these types of projects in a discussion earlier in a session where we were talking about the case of Toronto and the Sidewalk Labs project there, where the city government has teamed up with Alphabet for developing a smart city approach. And this is not so far from that case, actually. This is just one project from Beijing in China, where the World Bank has partnered with Mobike, a transportation company in China, to get access to their data, to use that data, build analytics around that data for improving the transportation infrastructure there. And we have many more of these cases globally, not only in China. There's a lot to benefit from. There's a lot that we can learn, but we can also use these types of cases very efficiently for providing tangible benefits for example, Beijing's citizens. But it's also a question of what kinds of principles and what kind of guidance we have in place for doing this, for developing these kinds of partnerships and doing this kind of work. So I think, especially in cases where we have a situation of the government having very weak capacity for regulation, or the legislation really not supporting or not providing necessary means, for example, for consumer protection or citizen protection, then there's a lot of responsibility that we have to make sure that things are done in the right way. And the UN Development Group in 2017 put out a publication on guiding principles, and these are something that different UN agencies, for example, are bound to follow in their operations in developing big data projects or private sector partnerships that deal with use of data, or lawful and legitimate use of data, risks, mitigation of risks, looking at data security, data retention, very importantly data minimization, data quality, open data, due diligence, etc. So, for example, third parties that UN agencies work with have to follow the same principles. That's the due diligence part of it. One good case of how these kinds of principles can be applied is the digital identity program that the World Bank has, called ID4D. This was built a few years ago out of the realization that there's a big part of the world's population that doesn't really have any kind of ID. And using digital ID as a kind of platform for leapfrogging development. The early results, for example, from a survey this year, show that the poorest 40% within the the world's low-income countries are least likely to have any kind of ID. So this is a huge issue for poor countries, for example, in Africa. The way that the program actually then works, it's not about picking a specific solution like Aadhaar in India or from many other parts of the world. It's a kind of a coalition building exercise. So they've developed common goals or common principles that should be used in digital ID projects, dealing with inclusiveness, dealing with designs of these systems, and dealing with governance of ID systems. And it's a kind of a snowball effect where they're building a coalition of organizations that can come on board and endorse the principles. They are very well aligned with the UN principles I showed in an earlier slide. But the practical implementations at the country level can vary. So it's not about even selecting a specific technology to be used. It's about creating principles and analytics around this space. So it's a kind of a two-pronged approach, where on the other hand, every new project begins with a systematic assessment of a country's existing legal framework to identify areas that should be strengthening in order for them to be able to put ID systems in place, especially focusing on data protection and non-discrimination. And secondly, looking at how that technical design in that specific context should be guided by the principles and benchmarks that are available globally. The analytic tool, the ID enabling environment assessment, looks at both legal recommendations and then safeguards. And these safeguards are something that are globally applicable in different contexts. So they have to be looked at in each specific case. And for example, in terms of data protection, they state that all data should always be obtained with consent. It always should be specified how that data is used, for what purpose, and the user should always be able to obtain and correct their data.
Do we have a question as well?
Or should we take them in?
A real clarity question.
If it's really, if it's,
I can take it now.
I'll post.
All right.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. So some cases about country implementations that are ongoing. So these have already begun. A lot of projects in Africa, some in Asia, countries like Philippines and Nepal. The ID program can work simply through providing advisory services and technical assistance. Some cases of that, the countries can themselves actually implement the project, but in many cases they are also kind of a financing mechanism for implementing national digital ID projects. A good new case, for example, is in West Africa and Nigeria, where there's a regional project ongoing or just beginning on developing a regional interoperability framework actually for West Africa, so that the countries, they develop ID systems that also talk to each other and can exchange information. And a little statistical piece about the World Bank's work. But this was just a kind of an overall picture of what we see as happening in this space. Not a lot of detail there, very high level, but I'm happy to kind of talk and answer any questions you might have. Thank you.